The day her mother died, Emily Sanders was 10 years old, and the world seemed to shrink around her. The small kitchen of their suburban home smelled of cinnamon and burnt toast, the light slanting through the curtains warm and comforting, as it had always been. And then it wasn't. The police arrived, whispered around her in voices too low and too calm, and told her that her mother, alone in the house that morning, had been killed. Murdered. The word echoed in her head like a bell in a cavern, leaving nothing but cold emptiness behind. She remembered the officers speaking to her father, who had left years before, leaving her and her mother to navigate life on their own. The detectives asked questions, scribbled notes, and eventually, with a polite nod and a shrug that felt like abandonment, told her that the case had gone cold. There were no leads, no witnesses, nothing but a shadow of a life stolen from her. The legal system had failed her. And from that moment, Emily vowed she would not. At first, it was small things. She memorized the details of the crime scene, the newspapers, the police blotters, anything she could find. She listened to her teachers, to the adults around her, and slowly began to understand the machinery of investigation, the way evidence could be pieced together, the way patterns emerged from chaos. By the time she was in high school, her room was a shrine to her obsession. Newspaper clippings, photographs, and notes covered every wall. Pins connected with red strings marked her mother's last movements, the places her mother had visited, the people she had known. Her friends drifted away. She didn't mind. She had a purpose that made the rest of the world fade. College brought new tools. Emily studied criminal justice, then forensic psychology, mastering databases and digital footprints, learning to track people without ever leaving her chair. She became fluent in social media, in digital mapping, in every platform where a person could leave traces of their life. For years, she worked in anonymity, taking internships at private investigation firms, absorbing everything she could about the law and its loopholes, the methods that could bring a cold case to life again. 20 years passed. Emily grew into a woman with a calm exterior, the kind of person people trusted instinctively. No one knew the fire that burned behind her eyes, the patience that had been honed like a weapon. She scoured old court records, dug through decades-old property transactions, cross-referenced Social Security data, and pieced together a web that seemed impossible to connect. The killer, she realized, wasn't hiding in some remote shack or foreign city. He was here, among ordinary people, blending seamlessly into everyday life. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. A message on a genealogy website led her to a distant cousin of her mother's old neighbor, a man who had been friendly but distant in her childhood memories. He had a social media presence that was almost painfully ordinary: family photos, travel pictures, weekend barbecues. But patterns began to emerge. A photograph from the day of her mother's murder showed a reflection in a window. A brief, indistinct shadow, but familiar to her trained eye. Over months, she cross-referenced every post, every check-in, every tag. Each small piece of data, invisible to the untrained eye, built a digital map of his movements, of his alibis, of the lies he told himself and others. It was in a quiet moment, watching him interact with his grandchildren on a sunny weekend in the park, that Emily knew she had him. The man who had laughed and told stories to neighbors, who had seemed harmless and warm, was the same man who had stolen her childhood, who had stolen her mother. She didn't rush. She didn't confront him. She continued to gather evidence, building a case that no one could dismiss, documenting every detail with the precision of a surgeon. Finally, after 20 years, she handed her files to the authorities, a dossier so thorough that it couldn't be ignored. DNA evidence, digital footprints, photographic proof, financial records, all pointing to the same man. Arrests were made. Court dates were set. And in the sterile courtroom, as he sat across from her, the same calm, smiling face she had studied for decades, Emily finally allowed herself a deep, trembling exhale. The world had not been kind to her, but she had endured. She had waited, hunted, and persisted. Justice, slow and meticulous, had arrived at last. She left the courthouse quietly, letting the sunlight fall on her face. For the first time in 20 years, she felt the weight on her shoulders lift. Her mother's name would never be forgotten, and the man who had stolen her life would never again threaten another. Emily walked into the world she had spent 2 decades mapping and unmasking, a world that suddenly seemed larger, freer, and filled with the possibilities she had denied herself in the pursuit of one singular truth. She had been a child, then a student, then a hunter. And now, finally, she could be simply herself. Even after the arrest, Emily didn't immediately feel relief. The years of obsession had left her with habits she couldn't shake. She double-checked doors, watched strangers' faces for tells, and cataloged the smallest inconsistencies in everyday life. Friends and colleagues told her she deserved to rest, but rest felt like surrender, like leaving a piece of herself behind. Her mother's absence had shaped every fiber of her being, and now, even with the killer behind bars, the void remained. She found herself revisiting memories, sifting through photographs and letters from her mother's old journals. Each page was a reminder of laughter lost, dinners shared, and quiet mornings that now seemed impossibly distant. Sometimes she imagined what her life might have been if her mother had lived, if birthdays had been celebrated, if ordinary struggles had been shared rather than carried alone. And sometimes, the imagining became almost unbearable, a stabbing grief that made her grip the edges of her desk until her knuckles went white. But there were victories, too. In private, Emily allowed herself to feel them. She traced the steps of her 20-year hunt like a trail of breadcrumbs, seeing how far she had come. A shy, determined 10-year-old recording facts in a notebook, a teenager devouring criminology texts, a young woman forging digital networks to map her mother's killer. Each stage of her life had been built around a single, unwavering goal, and she had achieved it with a precision that even she sometimes found frightening. The courtroom proceedings were surreal. She watched him, the man who had haunted her dreams, the same one whose ordinary smiles had masked horror, now floundering under the weight of undeniable proof. His attempts to charm the jury, to weave stories of innocence, fell flat against the decades of meticulously collected evidence. Emily listened in silence, letting the law speak for her, letting the system she had once thought had failed her finally work. And in the end, when the verdict was read, a quiet sense of triumph coursed through her. Not joy, exactly, but a hard-earned satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, the world continued its usual rhythm. Cars honked, children played, people hurried by. For a long moment, Emily just stood, letting the ordinary life move around her, feeling both part of it and apart from it. She realized that her mother's death had given her a purpose that defined her, shaped her, and now, in some strange way, freed her. She could step into the world without the shadow of vengeance dictating her every move. In the weeks that followed, Emily began to think differently about her life. She returned to old hobbies she had abandoned, books she had left unread, music that had gone unheard. She volunteered with local youth programs, teaching investigative skills, showing young people how to seek truth in the world. It was a way to honor her mother, to channel the intensity that had driven 2 decades of obsession into something creative and constructive. Even then, she remained vigilant. 20 years of watching and waiting had changed her. She knew the world could be cruel, that evil could hide behind polite smiles. But now, she understood that power didn't always come from brute force or malice. Sometimes it came from patience, intelligence, and persistence. She had learned to wield that power quietly, carefully, in a way that allowed justice to rise, even when the system seemed blind. At night, Emily would sometimes dream of her mother, walking through the house they had shared, laughing, calling her name. And in those dreams, she was no longer a child trapped in grief, no longer the hunter consumed by obsession. She was simply a daughter, remembering, honoring, and finally finding peace. 20 years of darkness had ended not with vengeance alone, but with understanding that the world could take so much from you, yet it could also give you the strength to reclaim it in ways no one else could. Emily had hunted, she had waited, and she had prevailed, not just against a killer, but against the way grief could shape and define a life. And for the first time, she felt the quiet thrill of possibility, that a life lived in pursuit of justice could also be lived for herself. Emily had learned early that patience was her greatest weapon. She didn't need to rush. Time worked in her favor. Each new social media platform, each digital archive she discovered, became a tool in her arsenal. She created multiple email addresses, carefully masked identities, and infiltrated online communities, all in the quiet hours of the night. She became a ghost, watching the world without being seen, piecing together fragments of information that most people would overlook. In her 20s, she discovered old newspaper archives that had never been digitized. Using microfilm readers in dusty libraries, she scanned through years of mundane local reporting, searching for patterns, mentions of her mother's neighborhood, casual reports of a man seen near the scene, even seemingly irrelevant disputes or minor complaints that might connect to her mother's killer. Slowly, a picture emerged, a man who appeared ordinary, invisible in his small-town charm, but whose past was peppered with subtle inconsistencies, small acts of violence, and a trail of secrecy. Emily learned to exploit the digital footprints people left unconsciously. She cross-referenced old-school yearbooks with LinkedIn profiles, mapped addresses from public records, and monitored public social media posts for seemingly trivial details: a throwback photograph of a house he had once lived in, a casual mention of a vacation that aligned with a gap in his alibi. Each tiny discovery became a thread she could pull, unraveling the story he had tried so carefully to bury. Her obsession wasn't just about catching him, it was about understanding him. She studied his mannerisms in old photographs and videos, learning how he presented himself to the world, how he manipulated perception, how he hid the monster within. She could anticipate his moves before he made them, predict which lie he would tell next, which detail he would try to bury in the digital noise. And all the while, she grew more adept, more patient, more methodical, until she was not just a hunter, but a master of shadows, tracing a predator who had eluded the law for decades. There were moments of despair. Months would pass without any lead, and she would sit in her dimly lit apartment, surrounded by maps, computer screens, and stacks of notes, feeling the crushing weight of 20 years of grief and solitude. Friends and lovers came and went, unable to understand the magnitude of her obsession. But Emily had no choice. The pursuit had become her life, her identity, her breath. She reminded herself that this was a game of decades, and every day without progress was not failure, but preparation. And then the breakthrough came, an old forum post, innocuous and forgotten, linking her killer to a distant relative of her mother's neighbor. At first, she couldn't believe it. The digital clue seemed too fragile, too subtle. But years of training told her to trust the pattern. She began monitoring him online, watching the way he interacted with friends, how he posted family pictures, how he left tiny breadcrumbs in conversations that no one noticed. She traced his vacations, cross-checked locations with old case reports, and slowly, with surgical precision, she reconstructed his movements on the day of her mother's murder. The final pieces fell into place when she noticed a reflection in one of his old photographs, a shadow, almost imperceptible, that aligned with her mother's last known location. She documented it meticulously, every screenshot, every timestamp, every social media interaction. She knew that presenting evidence alone wouldn't be enough. She needed a narrative, a chronological account so precise and damning that no defense could unravel it. By the time she presented her findings to the authorities, Emily was no longer a scared child or even a grieving young woman. She was a force of nature, calm, relentless, and exacting. Her dossier was overwhelming: financial records, digital footprints, property deeds, photographs, videos, and forensic analysis, all leading to the man who had lived in plain sight for 2 decades. Arrests were made swiftly, and the trial was a spectacle of truth confronting illusion. Sitting in the courtroom, watching him stumble under the weight of his exposure, Emily felt something she hadn't in 20 years. Closure. Not joy, exactly closure. She had transformed grief into action, despair into strategy, and obsession into justice. She allowed herself a small smile, not for revenge, but for the triumph of patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. And when the trial ended, Emily didn't disappear. She began helping other families with cold cases, sharing her skills, her methods, and her relentless patience. She taught that time could be an ally, that ordinary people could outwit the system when persistence met ingenuity. She had hunted, studied, waited, and finally prevailed. She had become the daughter who refused to surrender, who refused to forget, and in doing so, had carved justice from the shadow of loss. Even as she moved forward, she kept a quiet ritual. Each year, on the anniversary of her mother's death, she would light a candle in her old kitchen, remembering the warmth that had once filled the house. She would think of the 10-year-old girl who had sworn never to let the world forget, and she would whisper a promise. "I did it. I kept my word."